Hello everyone, in this video I will be discussing my theory on the game called Little Hope. It's by the same creators as Until Dawn and Medan. It just came out on October 30th, so if you haven't had time to play the game yet, I wouldn't recommend watching this video because it's going to be spoiling pretty much all of the plot, or if you'd rather watch a let's play of it, I would go to Jacksepticeye's channel. He did a live stream of it on Twitch about a week ago, and I watched that, but he just uploaded it on his channel recently, and this series is actually going to be based off the ending that he got. And even though I haven't seen any of the other endings, I did read a little synopsis of it on Wikipedia, and they don't really affect the overarching plot, whereas my theory pretty much just discusses like the main plot points, so it shouldn't matter too much that I've only seen one ending. So before I get started into discussing what my theory is, I would just like to give a little bit of background information about myself so that you can understand like where I'm getting my information from. So I haven't done any outside research on this. This is all pretty much from my knowledge I gained whenever I was in college. I have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience with an emphasis in psychology. So it's not necessarily a psychology major, but I did take a lot of psychology courses. And so I do have a lot of knowledge on psychology, although I'm not at all claiming to be an expert or a therapist or anything like that. This is just me speculating for the fun of it because I really find psychology to be something I'm passionate about. So this is all just purely speculation and for the fun of analyzing something through a psychological lens. So like Until Dawn and Medan, Little Hope is a game about survival, but it's survival in a different way. Its two previous games were about survival of the group, but Little Hope is about survival of the self. Whenever someone is put through severe trauma, the mind is incredible at coming up with ways for that person to survive, even if it means developing a grandiose delusion of the supernatural. So that's what this theory is going to be about on like a really vague sense, is just how Anthony Clarke was able to survive his untreated PTSD. So while I'm definitely not a therapist and I'm not an expert in PTSD, I think it's pretty obvious that Anthony Clarke has been suffering from PTSD for his whole adult life from the fire that happened in 1972. So going through something as traumatic as losing all 5 of your family members in one night is enough alone to cause PTSD. But what makes Anthony's worse is the fact that he harbors this guilt that is his fault for his whole life, because he thinks to himself, if he hadn't started that flame, then maybe his family wouldn't die. Or if he didn't walk away from the room, then he thinks, oh, maybe that wouldn't have happened. Or maybe he could have done something differently so that maybe one family member could have survived, or maybe 2 instead of all 5 of them dying. So Anthony, even by himself, harbors this terrible guilt that it's his fault his family died. And which would be enough, but then there's the fact that it's not just him that's blaming himself, it's others too. Like the passerby, when he approaches Anthony, he immediately is accusatory and he asks, what have you done, rather than what Anthony needed to hear, which was, are you okay? And that becomes really important later. After that, he gets arrested because he's suspected for the one that's causing the fire. So on top of blaming himself, and then getting blamed by the passerby, and then getting blamed by law enforcement, when he's finally cleared as innocent, he's still getting blamed by others like Vincent, and later on you find a newspaper clipping that says burn in hell when talking about him getting released. I'm assuming that the game takes place in 2020, which would mean that since the fire took place in 1972, that Anthony has been blaming himself for the past 48 years, and this kind of self-blame with untreated PTSD is so bad for a person. When someone is put through severe trauma on top of feeling like they are the reason why that trauma happened, it's incredibly hard for the mind to find ways for that person to cope with, on top of being traumatized. If you feel like it's your fault for that thing that happened, then it's so hard for you just to survive it on a day-to-day basis. Which is why at some point before the start of the game, Anthony, as the bus driver, he develops a delusion that his family members are in college, except he doesn't realize that they are his family members because in his mind he's repressed the trauma of what happened as part of a way to cope with the guilt that he felt. So before I get into what happens later on in the game, I like to pause here and really discuss what each college reincarnated version of Anthony's family member means to him, in my opinion. So the first thing I'm going to start with himself. So Anthony has this delusion of himself as a boy named Andrew, who is just right out of high school. He's 18 years old and he's a college student. And I think that this is because when that fire happened in 1972, it completely destroyed all chances he had of ever living a normal life or ever having a normal adulthood. So he was never able to just go to college and be a normal adult because his life pretty much was put on pause forever after that. So I think that's why Andrew is portrayed as an 18-year-old college student. Because Anthony should have been able to go to college and have a happy, normal life. Because he was a good kid and he cared so much about his family, but he wasn't. So I think that's why, in his mind, he wanted to have a version of himself that symbolized some sort of normalcy that he never got to have. And then next I'll be talking about the father. So Anthony's father, James, he was an alcoholic and he had an unstable job. He had been working in the factory for a while, and when he was arguing with Anne, they had mentioned how he's been saying for years that the factory might go under. So Anthony's ideal version of his dad is John, who is a sober college professor. Of course, being sober because Anthony didn't like that his father was an alcoholic. And if you're a college professor, there's always going to be students who are going to be enrolled in college. So therefore, being a college professor is a stable job. So his father would go from being an alcoholic with an unstable job to someone who is sober with a job that will always be stable no matter what. So Anthony's mother, Anne, wasn't really taken that seriously by James, and he kind of didn't really listen to what she had to say. John was a college professor and Angela was a student. So despite John being in an authority position over Angela, she didn't let him just call the shots because she was a really strong and independent character, which I think Anthony wanted to see more from his mother. So the college version of Anthony's older brother and sister is a bit weird, but I found a way to make sense of it. So back in the 70s, Tanya was dating Vincent, and Dennis really didn't approve of Vincent. He didn't like him that much, despite the fact that Tanya and Anthony both seemed to really like him. But I think the relationship between Taylor and Daniel is Anthony's way of processing that Dennis really didn't like Vincent and he thought he wasn't good enough for Tanya. And I think this is why throughout the game, despite like Angela picking up on them being a couple, Taylor just really wasn't ready to be open about their relationship, whereas Daniel is portrayed as wanting to be open about it and being okay with it. because Tanya was happy with her relationship, but Dennis wasn't not happy with the person that she chose to be with. So while editing, I figured out something that I didn't realize while I was recording originally. Basically, I think another reason why Taylor and Daniel are dating in Anthony's mind is because Anthony really loved Tanya and he was happy for her because he thought Vincent was a really good match for Tanya. But then whenever after the fire, Vincent blamed Anthony, so that was really hard for him. So in Anthony's mind, if Dennis was right about Vincent not being a good match, then it's a lot easier for him to alleviate the blame that he feels, because if Dennis was right and Vincent wasn't a good match, then Vincent's opinion on Anthony doesn't matter as much as it would. The little sister Megan is a bit different than the other family members because she wasn't a part of the college trip and she wasn't with everyone else on the bus ride. And we first see her in the street, which is what caused Anthony to crash the bus. So in the very beginning, before the fire started, Anthony is really the only one who truly seems to empathize with Megan. Tanya seems a lot nicer than everyone else, but even then, whenever Megan locked her outside, Tanya gets mad at her. And Anthony is really the only one who seems to really empathize with Megan. And I think Anthony's empathy for Megan stems from the fact that he was really able to see who she truly was. Megan was just a innocent little girl who was struggling with her own personal demons, but she was still a good person and she deserved a good, normal childhood. Of course, Anthony loved all of his family members, and he feels guilty about all of them, but I think the one that makes him feel most guilty is Megan's death, because in Anthony's eyes, he sees her as the most innocent of them all. Because he feels so guilty about her death in the 70s, he hallucinates her appearing in front of the bus as if he's killing her a second time. And this bus crash is what really starts the message of the mind doing what it must in order to survive severe trauma. So when the bus crashes, Anthony experiences a PTSD flashback. So when you have PTSD and you experience a flashback, it's so real. It's like you're reliving that exact moment. Because brains have the ability to store an exact concrete memory. And when you get PTSD and you get triggered, sometimes a flashback will happen. But that's what you see whenever you're playing as Anthony walking around his house in the 70s. Anthony walking around his house in the 70s is actually Anthony in the present time, after he crashed the bus, experiencing a PTSD flashback. So everything that you're playing as, everything that you're playing through is him reliving exactly what happened as if it was happening again a second time. And because of how horrible and traumatic that was for him, this causes his mind to break and really struggle with ways of finding how he's going to survive reliving this terrible night all over again. Because the human mind, when it's put under severe trauma, the thing that it prioritizes most is the ability for the human being to survive. It doesn't matter what kind of delusion that it will come up with, as long as that delusion helps someone survive a severe trauma, the brain will come up with that. And that is what the witch trials symbolizes. The witch trials symbolizes Anthony's mind shifting blame from himself to the supernatural. Because he just re-experienced this flashback of what happened, it's too much for him to cope with, and he can't handle the guilt. So his mind starts this huge delusion of the supernatural and reincarnation in order to shift blame so that it's no longer Anthony's fault. It's rather this grandiose supernatural thing that's out of any human's control. Because Anthony has lived in Little Hope, which was a witch trial town back in the 1600s, his mind is able to use what Anthony has learned about the witch trials as fuel for this delusion of reincarnation. And it's actually it's very interesting to me, because at first I couldn't figure out why the witch trials were even there in the first place, because when you first finish the game, you're left with this feeling like, well, what was the point of the witch trials? Was it just there for spooky jump scares and that's all? And it took me a while to figure out what the witch trials really meant. What the witch trials symbolizes a shift in Anthony's mind so that he doesn't blame himself because it's not his fault if his family was always destined to the same fate via reincarnation. Because how Anthony's family died in the 70s was pretty much exactly the same how they died in the 1600s. His father was crushed both times. His mother had smoke inhalation and then drowned in the 1600s, so both involved not being able to breathe. And then his older sister was hung both times. His older brother was impaled both times. So it becomes this coping mechanism where if his family has always been fated to die the same exact way over the past 300 years, then there's no way it's Anthony's fault. Because even if Anthony hadn't lit the fire, or if he hadn't walked away from it, his family would have still died in the same way because of reincarnation. So even though what happened with the witch trials was it wasn't real at all, it was just a delusion in Anthony's mind, it was his mind's way of allowing him to cope with the extreme amount of guilt and trauma he felt after going through that flashback and re-experiencing everything that happened to him again. He was not able to cope and survive with reliving that, so his mind did what minds do best, and it created this delusion of reincarnation to help Anthony survive, because that's what this whole game is about. At the end of the day, it's about the survival of the self when someone has been put through severe trauma. So next I'd like to discuss some of the side characters that weren't part of the main family. The first being the Reverend. So even though we don't see the Reverend in the 70s time, it's later learned that the Reverend of the witch trials is the same as the Reverend / priest in the 70s. And when you're first playing through the game, and going through the witch trial time, you're led to believe that Mary is a child possessed by the devil or a demon or something. But then as you continue to play more of the game, you realize it's actually the Reverend that is the bad part of the witch trial church. And although we don't know much about how the Reverend was in the 70s, we do see that he was writing letters to Mary's parents about her bad behavior. So I think that Anthony, because Anthony was able to see Megan for who she truly was, which is just an innocent child who just was going through her own personal demons. I think Anthony really empathized with Megan and didn't understand why the Reverend was being so harsh on her, and that's really portrayed through how you see the Reverend in those trial times, because it ends up being the Reverend who's the bad one, whereas everyone else kept blaming Mary over and over. I think this is just because Anthony truly saw Megan for who she was, whereas the rest of her family were just kind of blinded by faith a little bit, and they were just kind of trying to follow whatever the Reverend told them to do. So from how I interpret the story, I don't think Megan is actually possessed by a demon. I think it's more like a metaphorical thing for how she's going through her own personal demons. In the beginning of the game, it's implied that all the children are actually adopted, because whenever the mother and father are arguing, James brings up how maybe if they had had kids of their own, none of this would have been happening. So we're not really sure what Megan's past is, implying that she is adopted, and so she could have went through trauma before getting adopted. We don't really know what's going on with her, just that I interpret it to be that she's battling her own personal demons, and that but she still tries to be a good kid, which is what Anthony sees in her. But hearing her parents argue about her behavior at church and how she's troubled and stuff, and hearing how she's the cause of so many of her parents' arguments, it just really increases her loneliness that she feels. So I think that Megan does have an imaginary friend out of loneliness, because sometimes when a child is lonely, they can do that. Anthony, because he pays attention to Megan, he might have sometimes heard her talk to her imaginary friend. So whenever his mind was developing this delusion of the supernatural, as he was going through that flashback, I believe that as his mind was preparing to shift into that delusion of the supernatural, is when he in his mind he saw like the demon with Megan, because it's far easier to alleviate the blame of yourself if not only did your family die because of they're fated to all die because of reincarnation, but also if the fire was caused because Megan was being followed by an evil demon. But whenever you see like the actual scene of the doll falling onto the fire, there's nothing there. So I think she just placed it there and forgot about it, and then it just fell on accident. The whole thing was a complete accident. That's just how I interpret it, though. Now I'm going to be talking about Judge Wyman, who was the judge from the 1600s during the witch trials, and his reincarnated double is more subtle because you only see him like once in a little bit. He's the man called the Passerby that approaches Anthony and accuses Anthony of burning the house down by saying, "What have you done?" And at first this might seem like just kind of a random thing, but it's actually super significant because of Anthony's delusion of reincarnation. This helps alleviate the blame on him even more so, because in his delusion, if everyone is reincarnated to be the same way, then in the 1600s, the Passerby was a judge. Because in the 1600s, the Passerby was a judge whose job was to pass judgment on other people. And if reincarnation is real and everyone is fated to the same kind of fate, then it's not Anthony's fault that this passerby would immediately assume that Anthony was the one to burn it down, because if the passerby was a judge in a previous life and reincarnation causes the same thing to happen over and over, and this is just another way that his mind was trying to cope with trying to alleviate the blame that he felt by shifting it to the supernatural. So I'd like to talk about the ending where Anthony gets arrested, because that's the one that I saw. So at the end, when Vince had called the police on Anthony and he's getting arrested, Vince says that he'll never forgive him for what he did, and he proceeds to call him a murderer and tells him that he should go to hell. So normally, without this this shift of blame, thanks to his mind creating this delusion, Anthony wouldn't have been able to cope with Vincent calling him a murderer when he loved his family so much and he wanted to save them, and saying he'll never forgive Anthony. But because of this delusion, he's able to, at this ending, he looks outside of the car window and tells whoever survived that it's okay, I'm going to be just fine. And the reason why he's able to tell the delusions of his family members that aren't really there that he's going to be just fine is because his mind has already fabricated this delusion. He's already convinced himself that it's not his fault because it's supernatural, and which is out of human control. And that's how he's able to tell this delusion, which is really just telling himself that he will be okay because it's not his fault. Because something like supernatural reincarnation, where everyone's always fated to the same death, is not his fault, and there's nothing he could have done. And this kind of brings me to what I want to finish off with, how Anthony was a really, really good person, and it's really heartbreaking to me how he was a really good kid. The few moments you got to see him in the beginning when you're playing as him in the 70s, you really get an understanding for his character, even though you don't get to see it that much. And he really did love his family, and he wanted the best for them, and he was really kind to everyone, and he just wanted everyone to get along. And the fact that such a good person ended up, not only did he blame himself, but also the first person he saw, the passerby, blamed him, and then law enforcement blamed him, and then 48 years later, still Vincent is blaming him. It's really sad to me, and I think this game was intended to garner a lot of empathy from people, and like how and how you just never know what someone is going through, which is why you should always try and be as kind to people as possible, because at the end, Vincent never forgave Anthony and he blamed him for 48 years when it wasn't Anthony's fault at all, and Anthony loved his family so much. And shows that you shouldn't be so quick to judge people, because you never know exactly what kind of demons people are going through. There's this one quote that the curator says in the middle of the game that I think goes along with this message very well. It's a quote by Oscar Wilde, and it says, "Never judge anyone shortly, because every saint has a past and every sinner has a future." And I really like that quote, because it just shows that everyone either has their own demons that they're battling with currently, or has had them in the past. That it's always important to remain as kind-hearted and empathetic as you can towards people, because you never know what someone is truly going through and what struggles that they have in their life. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to discuss, and I hope that it made sense and that it helped people understand some of the deeper meaning of this game. And as I mentioned before, I'm not a therapist and I'm not a professional anything. I'm not an expert of psychology. This is just me taking my knowledge I learned from college and applying it in an analysis just for fun. And I hope that even if you haven't had any psychology classes before, that I was still able to explain things in a way that was able to be understood. And if you made it this far into the video, or even if you just watched a little bit, I just want to say thank you for watching it at all. And I hope that it helped you understand the game a little bit more. Just try to remember to always be kind and empathetic towards people, because you don't know what someone's going through, and the world is such a cruel place. It's just best to be kind towards others.